So I'll introduce Neel first and then let Neel speak, and then we'll move on to Cate. So Dr. Neel Ahuja is a visiting professor at the University of Maryland with appointments in the American Studies Department and the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies for the 2021 to 22 academic year. At the University of California, Santa Cruz, he's professor of feminist studies and a core faculty member of the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies program, where he serves on the advisory board of the Center for Racial Justice. As I'm sure you all know, Neel's research explores the relationship of the body to the geopolitical, environmental, and public health context of colonial governance, warfare, and security. Neel's the author of 2 books, Bioinsecurities from 2016, the subtitle Disease Interventions, Empire and the Government of Species, and Planetary Spectres, Race, Migration and Climate Change in the 21st Century, which was published in 2021. And he's currently working on 2 research areas, one exploring the race and species politics of COVID-19, and another analysing United States counterterrorism, incarceration, rendition and interrogation practices. I mean, we were drawn to Neel's work through the main piece of reading that we read today. And again, sort of playing with queer temporalities, we often like to go back in time with our speakers. So rather than looking necessarily at the most recent work, going back to the work that maybe first touched us or that we first came across, and sort of thinking about the evolution of people's work, how they return to certain themes, move on from others. So we really appreciate both Neel and Cate's kind of willingness to be taken back in time. So over to you, Neel.
First of all, thanks to Natasha and Marcin for organizing. I really appreciate being able to meet all of you today in the network. And I'm honored to be in conversation with Cate, who's such an important figure for me and others in this work. This is a bit of a trip back in time, and I'm trying to kind of think across what it meant to write Intimate Atmospheres back in that moment in the early 2010s, and try to kind of deal with the dissonance between that moment and the current one that we're in, where a lot of what we've had to deal with for the last 2 years has been a global pandemic that has in some ways mirrored prior pandemics, but in other ways has created new challenges, but also new possibilities. So, you know, one of the things that I think about when returning to this essay is some of the complicated rhetorics of parasitism and contagion that have been mobilized in very negative ways over the last couple of years. I think of the ways that in particular when you look at, for example, statements by political figures, the way that trans and queer communities have been targeted, particularly sex workers, as potential sites of transmission of COVID-19. This was certainly the case in India during the Modi government's kind of crackdown there. Though, you know, I was already kind of thinking about some of those things when I wrote Intimate Atmospheres, but I think that work was coming out of a different moment. I was, you know, on the one hand, I had written this book, Bioinsecurities, that was all about rhetorics of contagion. And then I was starting to think about environmental crisis and climate crisis and migration issues, and looking in particular at the ways that migrant communities were being configured as signs of global warming's coming threats to the global north. So just having a kind of sense of the ways that mosquito-borne diseases were kind of traveling along the same routes that some of the xenophobic rhetoric was traveling along, that inspired me to write that essay. And I was in part thinking through issues of reproductive futurity and debates in queer studies about that in relation to the climate crisis, and trying to put the two together and think about how you know, the figure of the child as a kind of fascistic figure was or was not playing out well for me when thinking about moving that into the realm of environmental crisis and thinking about the complicated ecologies of social reproduction that we all inhabit. So work in queer ecologies, particularly with the groundbreaking edited collection by Cate, was really important on that note. And the work that I did on climate change kind of developed from this essay in some different directions. And so I shared a kind of second piece that came from the new project called Planetary Specters, which ended up being a less focused in queer studies, but was really a kind of work in critical migration and refugee studies to think about the ways that climate change has been racialized, and not just the kind of pervasive racialization of climate disaster, but also the ways that the anticipation that certain ecologies are becoming unlivable has unfortunately been wielded against marginal populations in various parts of the world in negative ways. So how can we kind of grasp the massive destruction that's ongoing, the massive kind of collapse of our ecological systems that we must acknowledge, deal with, and work to reverse, while at the same time being attentive to the ways that rhetorics of parasitism, for example, might end up being deployed against migrants, and the ways that liberal discourse that responds to that sometimes overstates what it means to be a quote unquote climate refugee. That in fact, there are some longer term systems of inequality in neoliberal racial capitalism that have been pushing people to migrate en masse. And that although environmental disaster can be one node that pushes people to migrate, it's not simply that we can start seeing everybody who's migrating as a climate refugee. What is kind of gained and lost in that representation? And I think that there's the interest in disability studies that has grown for me over the past 10 years has been in part grappling with this. The humanitarian rhetorics that are kind of mobilized around climate refugees are ones that tend to promote kind of tragic visions of the refugee body, which is understandable given the immense tragedy that is, for example, the Syrian war, or the kind of mass displacements that rural agriculturalists around the world are facing in the current moment. These are, of course, extreme forms of violence that need to be grappled with on a large scale. But what happens when we turn individual refugees, especially disabled ones, into kinds of icons of what's happening? So my work has been, as someone trained in literary and cultural studies, in many of these pieces that I've written over the years has been focused on those forms of representation, the way that race, sexuality, disabled embodiments, and in fact, human-animal relationships and human relationships to broader ecologies are woven into these politicized tropes of a kind of racial reckoning of crisis. So I think that returning to that intimate atmosphere's essay in this moment makes me think about how, that it was published right before Trump was elected in the US and the rise of a lot of these other fascist figures in other countries. But I was already trying to think through, like, what is the kind of fascistic potential of rhetorics of parasitism, and how might anti-racist and queer publics respond to this. And today I'm focused on very much the same issue, even though I haven't kind of done all of that work as a conversation within queer studies. I've been engaged in these other fields like disability and critical refugee studies. So that's a little bit about how this essay fits in. I have to also say that, for me, there is a fascination with understanding life worlds, ecologies, ways of inhabiting Earth that are not solely anthropomorphic in nature. And I was really interested in thinking about, like, how a mosquito navigates a new environment when it's rendered a quote unquote invasive species. I'm not denying that the migrations of mosquitoes are a public health problem sometimes, but I also wanted to think with what it meant for mosquitoes to be moving, to be inhabiting life worlds where humans form part of their reproductive chains. And even to think, like, on a small scale with, like, what does it look like from a mosquito's vantage point to see a human that it's about to feed on? I think that such gestures, they can become romanticized. And so I hope that I didn't do that in the essay. But part of what it means to think through that is to also understand how forms of scientific research are working through those life worlds, perhaps trying to contain the forms of life that we encounter through these entanglements with other species. But also how human bodies are not the kind of abstracted figure that liberal humanism often views them as, and that we're constituted through these complicated life worlds we share with other species. So how can we reorient our analyses of power, understanding that they're enmeshed with vital materialities that are beyond the human? And so I tend to think about that in terms of human relationships to viruses and or to animals, or crossing all three. But I know that Cate has fascinating things to say about plants today, and I'm hoping that I can learn more on that front and think with you all about these complicated entanglements, which might lead us towards some new issues we need to discuss in terms of queer social justice movements. So this is a kind of broad sweep of what I've been thinking of where that essay fits into longer projects. But I'm just really excited to meet you all today and to learn more about your work and interests and to see where we can find some common ground. That's all.
Thanks so much, Neel. It's really helpful to hear, where you place the intimate atmospheres essay in your work, and just think about how it connects, and how we've been thinking a lot about disciplines and how we may sort of earlier interests, such as in your case, queer, sort of the direct engagement with queer theory, how you may have sort of shifted that focus. And I think what both of your work does sort of so beautifully and provocatively is shifting between these sort of micro and macro scales, and really not allowing for kind of abstraction, like always returning to the sort of concrete material kind of direct sort of environment. So yeah, we're just so happy to have both of you here. So moving on to Cate, Professor Cate Sandilands is Professor of Environmental Studies at York University. And her research areas include environmental humanities and eco-criticism, environmental public cultures and biopolitics, queer, trans and feminist ecologies, critical plant studies, and biocultural diversity and multi-species cohabitation. Like Neel, she's published prolifically, but we personally were drawn to her work through the brilliant and, as Neel said, groundbreaking edited collection with Bruce Erickson, Queer Ecologies, Sex, Nature, Politics, Desire, from 2010. Cate's current projects include, we're really excited in particular about Plantasmagoria, botanical encounters in the Anthropocene. We wait it with great interest because in this network, we're really interested in forms of research that kind of experiment with the limits of conventional scholarly form and what kind of creative engagements with the written text might do to how research is communicated. So yeah, we're really interested in that project, Cate. And Cate describes this project as drawing on her current plant-based research interests and will result in a collection of creative non-fiction, personal and critical essays on botanical biopolitics, environmental history, human-plant encounters, plant fictions, and everyday plant relationships as elements in an expansive multi-species environmental justice politics. And another project that Cate's working on at the moment is on the literary and political legacy of British Columbian writer, author Jane Rule. So thank you, Cate, for being with us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Marcin and Natasha and Hakan for organizing this. Thank you to Neel for a very provocative and fascinating introduction to the broad sweep of your work and its transformation. I am coming to you from the traditional and ongoing territories of the Penelakut, Lamulki, and Sawasan peoples, which are and also the traditional territory of other Coast Salish speaking peoples, otherwise known as Galliano Island, which is a small rural island off the coast of British Columbia. I knew that I would be that I would get carried away by Neel's talk and want to immediately leap into conversation. So I've actually written my comments as a form of necessary self-discipline. So I'm calling it 10 provocations. I'm just considering it 10 provocations toward a discussion. How much has changed in the 12 years since Queer Ecologies was published, and even more since I actually wrote the Melancholy Natures article you've read for today's conversation. Then I was able to write such things as the idea that there is a relationship between an engagement with environmental loss and environmental responsibility suggests a dimension of environmental thought that has not been particularly well explored, even if the fact of that loss seems an all-pervasive condition of modernity. I was able to write, there is in late capitalist nature relations a patina of nature nostalgia in place of any kind of active negotiation of environmental mourning. And I was even able to write, by understanding nature as something lost at the hands of modernity, and by witnessing its demise in the fetishized chunks that are offered up to spectacular consumption by modernity, the victory of modernity, the modernity responsible for this loss is confirmed. This logic of modernity, which was shaky at best in 2010, seems now very publicly in tatters. Further, environmental, ecological, and climate grief are now recognized by, among others, the American Psychological Association, which writes that 47% of young people aged 18 to 34 indicated the stress they experience due to climate change affects their daily lives. If that isn't enough evidence, ecological grief has its own Wikipedia page. How strange it is now to think that ecological grief might need some kind of emotional proxy, something concrete to allow people to name their loss as grief in order to begin talking about it outside triumphalist narratives of ecological modernization, when the grief itself is so palpable, immediate, and life-altering. 2. How privileged was I in 2010 to imply that such grief was not already very critical in the lives of, for example, Indigenous peoples, for whom environmental apocalypse was and is very much an historical and ongoing process, per Kyle White, and not something that could be folded into a progressivist story that somehow required queering. Living in a world of wounds is not only a queer ecological orientation to vulnerability and loss, it is a grim reality for land-based Indigenous and other communities globally. 3. How much resonance I still find in this article, even after 12 years. One question stood out. What would it mean to consider seriously the environmental, and I now add colonial, extractive capitalist present as a pile of wreckage, constituted and haunted by multiple personal and deeply traumatic losses, around which to imagine and share public melancholy as a practice of collective grieving, remembering, and survival? Or to put it slightly differently, how does melancholy, understood as an affect with some powerful legs in queer theory, continue to hold out promise as a mode of engagement with ecological loss and devastation? How might communities of practice and support emerge through the recognition of entangled vulnerabilities and shared and cross-cutting constitutive losses? 4. There's that word, entangled. In the last decade, the emergence of what one might broadly call posthumanism, or as the title of the special issue of GLQ in which Neel's Intimate Atmospheres appears, inhumanism, has demanded the consideration of ways in which people's lives and relationships are bound up with the agencies of others, lives and non-lives alike. Where Neel's article explores queer forms of reproduction incurring in the, quote, assemblage of carbon, water, virus, insect, and human within capital-driven ecological transitions, others have considered assemblages and entanglements as opportunities to explore a range of queer relationalities, kinships, and intimacies, both desired and undesired. 5. To respond at last directly to the question, how do our engagements with queer theory and practice influence our approaches to ecological justice and vice versa? I'd have to say that this emphasis on queer relationalities, kinships, and intimacies amid and against settler, colonial, extractive, heteropatriarchal focuses on relationship and inheritance remains one of the most important elements of queer theory's contributions to environmental thought, arts, and justice. Although there are other paths into understanding more than human kinship, for example, through some Indigenous understandings of non-human personhood, I still find deep emotional and political purchase in the idea and practice of queer ecological kinship and of registering in human intimacies in a way that doesn't add them to or expand them from heteronormative forms, but rather challenges us to rethink what intimacies and relationships can and will sustain us in these times, especially given the massive rearrangement of intimacies, kinships, and corporeal affective relationships that has accompanied COVID, and even more massive rearrangements that are underway in the climate emergency. Astrida Neimanis simply calls it everything change. 6. As Neel wrote in Intimate Atmospheres, and as Eva Heifa-Girard has expanded in her recent book, What Comes After Entanglement, however, quote, Neel, methodologies that take seriously interspecies entanglement are a political starting point rather than an ethical end. What I would add to my answer about queer theory and environmental engagement then is that for me, the emphasis on environmental justice, on the necessary worldliness of theory, on thinking about different forms of practice, compels me to think about these entanglements in particular ways. Ontological elegance is not the same thing as world-facing praxis. And while I'm committed to queering as a critical project, I'm also ethically and politically obliged to explore queering ecology as a matter of living and acting and not just thinking differently. There's a lot to say about, just a tiny addition to my carefully prepared notes. There's a lot to say about queer ecological art, which I've noticed has recently expanded. There's a vibrant community of queer ecological exploratory art, which I'd also be very interested in talking about. 7. For me, as you may have noticed in the other article I sent for reading, this has involved digging deeply into the soil, both literally and theoretically, of relationships with plants. Like Derek Jarman's garden, however, I don't mean plants in general. I mean particular plants with whom we have formed close relationships in specific places. And I mean figuring out not only how we share time and place because of our mutual implication in specific entanglements, but also how these entanglements might serve as sites of ethical relationship, practice, and pedagogy, as well as potentially politics. 8. I love Jarman's queer garden and the way he created space and memory as a botanical entanglement, literally, of personal, vegetal, sexual, energetic, economic, and geopolitical histories. I also love Mel Y. Chen's recent essay in Sex Ecologies that centers on a reflection on their California COVID-prompted vegetable garden, which they describe as a place of arranged cultivation that also includes many unintended influences that connect the space, including an especially luscious eggplant, to fire, pollution, aesthetics, racism, colonialism, the prison industrial complex, sex, frogs, and debility. These are deeply particular forms of entanglement that invite us to consider multiple points of intervention, not, as Girard's book tends to suggest for those of you who have read it, to lose the possibility of politics in a web of knotted agencies and responsibilities. They are also very much centered on gardening as a lived and embodied and emplaced practice of dealing with entanglement. The cauliflower that will not grow in Jarman's garden, the eggplant that thrives and absorbs toxic wildfire ash in Chen's, and of spending thoughtful time in a practice of creative destruction or destructive creation that is centered on the arranged cultivation of queer kinships and intimacies. 9. I know a focus on gardens will not either solve climate change or dismantle extractive capitalism, or for that matter, revolutionize queer theory. However, if, along with Foucault, we consider gardens as heterotopic spaces, we can see them as microcosms of queer ecological cultivation, both small embodied places in the world that exist in specific times and places, toxic though they may be. Sorry, I've just lost my place. And spaces that also attempt to create the totality of a desired other world in microcosm for the sake of a present or future queer alternative. Gardens are in and of the world, but also worlds in their own right. that cultivate us as complex human actors, even as we make dense ethical and practical choices in an attempt to bring mutually enriching kinships into being. 10. For similar reasons, as Natasha has suggested, I am increasingly drawn into practices of storytelling, and what are gardens if not stories, that focus not only on the depiction of queer ecological relationalities, but also on the narrativization of and speculation about what living in this entanglement might entail ethically and politically. Is this a withdrawal from serious geopolitical engagement? Perhaps it is at the level of theoretical reach and relevance. But I've learned a lot since Queer Ecologies was published, and even though I can clearly see this tendency toward cherishing the stubborn insistences of particularity in my earlier work, I've also learned that it's often through these storied particularities that queer communities emerge, and not just in theory.
Well, thanks so much, Cate. That was really beautiful. Another play with form with the 10 provocations. So yeah, really enacting why we're so drawn to your work.